A wealthy woman fired her elderly maid for a simple mistake, but when she showed up at the maid's house the next day, she was completely shocked. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through Lydia Carrington's grand dining room, mingling with the hum of sophisticated conversation. The night was perfect. A chandelier glowed above the long table, casting a warm light on the exquisite spread of food, the pristine white tablecloth, and the impeccably dressed guests seated around her. Everything had been orchestrated to the finest detail, just as Lydia demanded. She took a sip of her wine, relishing the fleeting moment of triumph. As the hostess of the evening, she thrived on perfection, her image meticulously maintained in the eyes of her wealthy social circle. But then, the moment shattered. A gasp swept through the room as Mrs. Green, the elderly maid who had served Lydia for over a decade, stumbled while refilling a glass of wine. A splash of deep red liquid splattered across the silk tablecloth, creeping toward the center like a spreading stain on Lydia's vision of flawlessness. Time seemed to slow, the crimson stain glaring against the delicate fabric, and in that instant, Lydia's face hardened. "Mrs. Green!" Lydia snapped, her voice slicing through the air like a sharp blade. All eyes turned toward the source of the outburst, the once cheerful atmosphere now replaced by tense silence. Mrs. Green, visibly shaken, dropped her gaze to the floor. I'm terribly sorry, ma'am," she stammered, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled to blot the stain with a napkin. Her voice was fragile, an apology echoing in the tense space. But Lydia was already consumed by anger. The evening had been too important, too perfect, and this mistake, this blunder, had ruined it. "This is unacceptable," Lydia continued, her words cold and cutting. "I trusted you to manage the evening without any mishaps, and you couldn't even handle a simple task." Mrs. Green's face, lined with years of quiet service and loyalty, crumpled in response. "I'll clean it up right away. It was just—" "No, it's too late for that," Lydia interjected, her voice sharp. She turned away from her guests, avoiding the mix of awkward glances and hidden smirks that danced around the table. Mrs. Green had been a constant presence in her home for so many years, but at that moment, all Lydia saw was an obstacle in her perfectly curated life. "You're dismissed, Mrs. Green," Lydia declared, her voice final. "I can't have someone I can't trust in my home." For a brief second, Mrs. Green stood frozen, as if she hadn't fully comprehended the words. Her eyes, normally so calm and warm, clouded with humiliation and pain. "But ma'am, Go!" Lydia's tone left no room for argument. The guests at the table shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. After all, no one wanted to challenge Lydia Carrington, not in her own home, not after the years she had spent cultivating her power and influence over them. Mrs. Green, her shoulders slumped with resignation, quietly excused herself from the room, head bowed low. She didn't look back as she exited, and Lydia didn't bother to watch her leave. The door closed softly behind her, and the conversation gradually resumed, though the energy of the evening had dimmed. Lydia sat back in her chair, her fingers lightly drumming the table, eyes fixed on the remnants of the wine spill. For the rest of the night, Lydia refused to allow any remorse to surface. She convinced herself that Mrs. Green's carelessness had earned her dismissal. She had hired her to ensure everything ran smoothly, and tonight had proved otherwise. There was no room for mistakes in Lydia's world, especially not in the grand events that defined her social standing. Later, when the guests had gone, Lydia retreated to her study with a glass of champagne in hand. The night had regained some semblance of order, but she couldn't shake a small, creeping feeling of unease. She pushed it down, telling herself that Mrs. Green's absence would hardly be noticed. After all, servants were replaceable. As she sipped her drink, she looked around her luxurious surroundings, the polished marble floors, the art-adorned walls, and the crystal chandeliers. Everything in her life was as it should be, perfect, controlled, untouchable. And yet, as she took her final sip of champagne, a shadow of doubt flickered in her mind. But it was fleeting, and she went to bed that night with the same sense of superiority she had always carried with her, unaware of the restless thoughts that would greet her in the morning. Lydia woke the next morning to a thin beam of sunlight filtering through the heavy drapes of her bedroom. The soft rustle of the breeze outside, mingling with the distant sounds of the city, did little to soothe her lingering unease. She stretched, pushing the silk sheets aside, but as soon as her feet touched the cold marble floor, a strange sense of heaviness settled over her. The events of the previous night played back in her mind, sharp and vivid. The stain, the raised voices, and the look on Mrs. Green's face as she left the room. Lydia tried to shake it off, telling herself once more that she had done the right thing. Mrs. Green's mistake had been unforgivable, especially in front of her esteemed guests. She couldn't afford any hint of imperfection in her well-curated world. Yet something was different this morning. Lydia's sharp sense of righteousness, which had been so clear the night before, had dimmed. Over breakfast, she tried to focus on her usual routine. She read the paper, glanced at emails on her phone, but the words blurred together, her thoughts drifting back to Mrs. Green. She had always been so reliable, so quiet and unobtrusive, attending to Lydia's every need for years without a single complaint. In all that time, there had never been an error. Last night was the first. It had been such a small mistake. A voice at the back of Lydia's mind whispered that she had overreacted. Perhaps it had been her own stress from hosting that had pushed her to such a rash decision. The dinner party had to be perfect. She had demanded perfection. But was it really worth sacrificing years of service for one minor incident? She sipped her coffee, her fingers tapping lightly on the side of the porcelain cup. Mrs. Green had always seemed so sturdy, so reliable. She was older now, slower than she once was, but she never complained about the work. Lydia's brow furrowed as she tried to picture what Mrs. Green must be feeling this morning. She had sent her away without so much as a proper conversation. No second chance, no opportunity to explain or make amends. The memory of Mrs. Green's downcast eyes as she left the dining room stirred something unfamiliar in Lydia: guilt. By mid-morning, the feeling had grown too large to ignore. Lydia found herself pacing the grand foyer, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble as she tried to shake the sensation. It had been a moment of frustration, she told herself again. Mrs. Green had been careless and Lydia had acted accordingly. But no matter how often she repeated the justification, it did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She paused near the window, gazing out over the manicured lawn that stretched toward the horizon. What if Mrs. Green had nowhere else to go? Lydia had never asked about her personal life, never considered what Mrs. Green did beyond the walls of her mansion. She assumed, like many in her position, that those who worked for her were dependent on the paycheck she provided. The idea that Mrs. Green might be suffering, alone, ashamed, and unemployed, made Lydia's stomach twist uncomfortably. The unease transformed into action. Lydia decided then and there that she would visit Mrs. Green. She would go to her home, apologize for the harshness of her decision, and perhaps even offer her job back. After all, a simple mistake shouldn't be the end of a working relationship that had lasted more than a decade. Mrs. Green had been loyal, and maybe it was time for Lydia to acknowledge that loyalty. The guilt spurred Lydia into motion. She grabbed her coat and car keys, preparing to leave without even notifying her staff. She drove herself, something she hadn't done in years, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the familiar roads. The cityscape began to fade as she moved toward the outskirts, where she imagined Mrs. Green must live. A modest home, humble, perhaps in need of repair. Lydia pictured the elderly maid living alone in a small, simple house, far removed from the opulence of her own estate. As she drove, Lydia rehearsed what she would say. She'd apologize, admit that her reaction had been hasty, and offer Mrs. Green her position back. After all, it was the least she could do. The woman had been nothing but loyal, and if anything, Lydia's pride had gotten in the way. The car turned onto a quiet street, and Lydia felt her heart race slightly. She slowed, looking at the address she had for Mrs. Green, preparing for the moment when she would see her maid, humble and possibly still heartbroken from the night before. But as Lydia approached the address, her heart skipped a beat. What she saw was nothing like she expected. Lydia's car slowed to a near crawl as she approached the address, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. This couldn't be the right place, she thought, checking the numbers once more against the small scrap of paper in her hand. The street she was on was quiet, lined with towering trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The houses here weren't the modest, rundown homes she had envisioned. In fact, they were anything but. Her gaze shifted to the house in front of her. No, not a house, an estate. It was massive, its sprawling lawns perfectly manicured, with flower beds brimming with vibrant blooms. A cobblestone driveway arched gracefully toward the entrance, where an elegant fountain gurgled softly in the center. The estate was grand, more luxurious than most she had ever seen, and easily rivaled her own mansion in both size and splendor. Lydia sat motionless for a moment, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing. She must have made a mistake. There's no way this could be Mrs. Green's home. Mrs. Green, her maid, the woman who had worked for her for so many years, couldn't possibly live here. Lydia stared out the window, her heart thudding in her chest as her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "This can't be right," she muttered to herself. She double-checked the address again. No, it was correct. But how? She pulled her car up to the front of the estate, feeling a mix of confusion and curiosity wash over her. Lydia hesitated before stepping out, adjusting her coat and smoothing her hair, suddenly feeling as though she were the one who needed to make an impression. Her mind raced, searching for some logical explanation. Perhaps Mrs. Green was staying with a relative, or maybe she had taken on a caretaker role for the owners of this estate. That must be it, Lydia reasoned, though the idea felt thin even as she thought it. The crisp autumn air greeted her as she walked up the stone path to the front door. The gardens surrounding her were immaculately kept, and Lydia couldn't help but marvel at the attention to detail. She reached the door and, after a brief hesitation, rang the bell. The chime echoed pleasantly, reverberating through the large home. She stepped back, bracing herself for whatever or whomever was about to greet her. The door opened a moment later, and there stood Mrs. Green, dressed neatly in a simple but elegant dress, her expression as calm and composed as ever. For a second, Lydia couldn't find her voice. Mrs. Green seemed utterly unfazed by the presence of her former employer on her doorstep, as if the events of the previous night had never occurred. "Mrs. Carrington," Mrs. Green said warmly, her smile soft and genuine. "What a surprise. Please, come in." Lydia blinked, caught completely off guard. Thank you," she managed to stammer. Stepping inside, her eyes widened as she took in the grand foyer. Marble floors stretched out beneath her, and a sweeping staircase curved elegantly to the second floor. The interior was just as grand as the exterior, if not more so. Polished wood, ornate chandeliers, and tasteful art adorned the space, and Lydia found herself momentarily speechless. Mrs. Green led her into a sunlit sitting room that overlooked the vast garden. Everything was so meticulously arranged, from the plush furniture to the fresh flowers in delicate vases. It was a room fit for royalty, not for someone she had dismissed as a mere maid. Lydia lowered herself into one of the chairs, still trying to wrap her mind around what she was seeing. I came to apologize," Lydia began, her voice faltering slightly. She felt out of place, dwarfed by the elegance of her surroundings. "About last night, I overreacted and I wanted to offer you your position back." Mrs. Green, still standing with perfect posture, tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Carrington, but there's no need for that." Lydia blinked. "No need? But..." Mrs. Green gave a small, knowing nod. "There are things about my life that I never felt the need to share. My late husband left me quite well off, and I've lived here for many years. I continued to work because I enjoyed it. It gave me purpose. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the woman in front of her, suddenly seeing her in a completely different light. Mrs. Green, the woman she had dismissed so easily, was not at all who Lydia had thought she was. The realization hit her with a force she wasn't prepared for, and for the first time, Lydia found herself at a loss for words. Mrs. Green moved with calm grace as she poured tea into fine china cups, the soft clink of porcelain the only sound in the spacious room. Lydia sat still, hands resting in her lap, her mind racing to catch up with the situation. She had come expecting to find a humbled, perhaps even broken woman, and instead, she was faced with someone completely in control of her world, far more than Lydia had ever imagined. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but Lydia felt the weight of her unspoken questions growing by the second. Mrs. Green finally took her seat across from Lydia, her eyes warm and steady. "I'm sure this is not what you expected," she said, offering a gentle smile as she handed Lydia a cup of tea. Lydia's fingers brushed the delicate cup, her grip slightly tense as she took it. "No, I didn't expect this at all," she admitted, her voice softer now, the edges of her usual bravado worn down by the shock of her surroundings. "I had no idea you lived like this." Mrs. Green nodded, unbothered by the surprise in Lydia's voice. "I never felt the need to share the details of my personal life," she said simply. "It didn't seem relevant to my work, and I preferred to keep it that way." Lydia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, still trying to process the new image of Mrs. Green that had unfolded before her. This wasn't the woman she had known, or thought she had known. For so many years, she had viewed Mrs. Green as just another servant, someone who depended on the paycheck and the status Lydia's household provided. The truth was startlingly different, and it left Lydia feeling oddly small in the presence of this woman who had so effortlessly shattered her assumptions. "I don't understand," Lydia murmured, more to herself than to Mrs. Green. She set her cup down on the small table, her hand resting on the arm of the chair as she leaned forward slightly. "If you didn't need the money, why would you choose to work as a maid?" Mrs. Green didn't respond immediately. She took a measured sip of her tea, her eyes briefly drifting to the window that overlooked the sprawling gardens. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and reflective, as if she had given this explanation many times before, if only to herself. "I've always enjoyed taking care of others," Mrs. Green said. "It gives me a sense of purpose. My husband and I were comfortable, yes, but after he passed, I found myself needing something more than just an empty house and memories to fill my days. Working for you and your family allowed me to stay busy, to feel useful, and to interact with people. It's never been about the money." Lydia stared at her, still grappling with the concept. It was so foreign to her, working for pleasure rather than necessity. Her entire life had been built around the pursuit of wealth, status, and the power that came with it. The idea that someone like Mrs. Green, with all her hidden wealth, would choose to humble herself by serving others was almost incomprehensible. "I never knew," Lydia whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There was no arrogance in her tone now, just genuine bewilderment. "All these years, I had no idea." Mrs. Green smiled gently. "I didn't want you to know," she said. "I wasn't there for recognition or praise. I enjoyed my work, and that was enough for me." Lydia felt a flicker of discomfort in her chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with the elegant surroundings or the unfamiliar situation. It was the realization that she had never really seen Mrs. Green before, at least not beyond the role she had assigned to her. She had dismissed her as an employee, someone whose worth was tied to the tasks she completed, without ever considering the full person behind the uniform. "I owe you more than just an apology," Lydia said quietly, her voice thick with the weight of her own realization. "I treated you as if you were beneath me. I never asked about your life, never thought to wonder about you as a person." Mrs. Green waved her hand dismissively, her expression kind. There's no need for that, Mrs. Carrington. We all see the world in our own way, shaped by our experiences. You've lived a life where appearances matter, and I don't blame you for assuming what you did." Lydia swallowed, her throat tight with a mixture of embarrassment and guilt. The woman sitting across from her, with her quiet grace and wisdom, seemed more at peace than Lydia had ever felt in her own life of luxury. It was humbling, in a way that Lydia hadn't expected, a slow, sinking feeling that she had been missing something important. All along, as they sipped their tea, the room fell into a comfortable silence, the sun casting a warm glow through the large windows. Lydia realized with a quiet certainty that this conversation had only just begun. The sunlit parlor seemed to close in on Lydia as Mrs. Green's words settled in the air between them. The weight of everything unsaid pressed down on her, making her feel smaller in a way she had never experienced. Lydia, a woman who thrived on control, on being at the top, suddenly found herself sitting across from someone who seemed to be the very embodiment of everything she lacked: grace, wisdom, and contentment. Lydia cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "You've lived this life," she began hesitantly, her voice soft, "without needing to. You could have done anything, lived anywhere, but you chose to stay as a maid." Mrs. Green smiled, but it wasn't condescending. It was the smile of someone who had long ago made peace with choices that others couldn't understand. "Yes," she said simply, setting her teacup down. "It was a choice, and one I've never regretted." Lydia stared at her, grappling with the idea. Her mind, conditioned to measure worth through wealth and status, struggled to comprehend why anyone would choose a life of service when they didn't have to. For Lydia, every decision had always been about elevating herself, making sure she stayed on top, where the world could see her and respect her. "I don't understand," Lydia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "All my life, I've thought that the goal was to achieve as much as possible, to rise above others, to show the world that you've made it. And here you are, with more than most people could ever dream of. And yet you chose to serve," Mrs. Green finished for her, her tone gentle but firm. "I didn't see it as lowering myself. To me, it was the opposite. I found fulfillment in doing something for others. My life wasn't about accumulating more wealth or being seen. It was about the quiet satisfaction of helping, of knowing that what I did, no matter how small, made a difference in someone's life." Lydia shifted in her seat, her fingers nervously smoothing the fabric of her coat. It was a perspective she had never considered, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt a sense of discomfort rising within her. All her life, she had believed that power came from being in charge, from being above others. But now, sitting here, across from Mrs. Green, who had so quietly and humbly chosen a different path, Lydia couldn't help but feel as though she had missed something essential. Mrs. Green continued, her voice soft but sure. "I think we all have our own ways of finding meaning in life. For you, it's been through success, through hosting grand parties, and being at the center of it all. And there's nothing wrong with that. But for me, I found meaning in the simpler things. After my husband passed, I realized that all the wealth in the world couldn't fill the spaces in my life that were left empty. So I turned to work, not for money, but for purpose." Lydia felt her heart tighten. The conversation was turning a mirror back on her, forcing her to look at the choices she had made. And for the first time, she felt an inkling of doubt. Had she spent so much time chasing after status that she had forgotten to look for meaning? She glanced at Mrs. Green, who sat there so calmly, as though she had everything figured out. Lydia, on the other hand, despite her wealth and success, suddenly felt lost. "I don't know if I could do what you've done," Lydia admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've always been so focused on staying at the top, on being perfect. I've never stopped to think about what it all means." Mrs. Green's eyes softened, and for the first time, Lydia noticed the lines of age around them, not as signs of weariness, but as marks of experience. "It's never too late to reflect, Mrs. Carrington," she said kindly. "Life has a way of showing us what's truly important, even if it takes time. Sometimes it takes a mistake to open our eyes." Lydia's breath caught. The word mistake hung between them, and she knew exactly what Mrs. Green meant. It wasn't just about the spilled wine or the dismissal. It was about the way Lydia had been living her life, with blinders on, focusing only on appearances, success, and her standing in the world. She had been running so fast toward an ideal that she hadn't stopped to see what she was running past. The irony of it all struck her. Here was Mrs. Green, the woman she had dismissed as beneath her, offering her the very thing Lydia had been searching for all her life: clarity. For the first time in a long time, Lydia sat in silence, allowing herself to really think. Not about the next party, the next status symbol, or the next move in her social chess game, but about what truly mattered. And in that quiet moment, she felt something shift inside her, a small but significant change in the way she saw the world. In the days that followed, Lydia found herself returning to her conversation with Mrs. Green over and over again. Every word, every quiet moment of reflection seemed to stick with her, unsettling her in ways she hadn't expected. She had left Mrs. Green's estate feeling humbled, though at the time she couldn't fully grasp why. Now, in the silence of her own mansion, the weight of their talk was beginning to unravel parts of her carefully curated life. Lydia stood in front of her vanity, brushing her hair absently as she looked at her reflection. The woman who stared back at her was polished, poised, and utterly put together. Yet for the first time, Lydia saw through the surface. She had spent years building an image, one that screamed perfection and success to anyone who looked her way. But now she wondered if that image had become a cage, trapping her in a life of hollow ambition. As she moved through her daily routines, Lydia couldn't help but notice the emptiness of it all. The meticulously arranged decor of her home, the extravagant clothing that filled her closet, the constant need to maintain an air of superiority. It all felt like a performance, and she had been the star of this show for so long that she hadn't stopped to question if it was what she truly wanted. Her thoughts kept circling back to Mrs. Green, a woman who had quietly chosen a path of purpose over wealth. Lydia had assumed power came from control, from having the most, being the best, and staying at the top. But Mrs. Green's life was evidence of something entirely different. She had found meaning not in status, but in service. And that realization shook Lydia to her core. She found herself drawn to Mrs. Green again, not as a former employer, but as a woman seeking answers. A week after their first conversation, Lydia reached out and arranged another visit. This time, she arrived at the estate without the burden of guilt or the need to make amends. Instead, she came with an open heart, ready to learn. Mrs. Green welcomed her warmly, just as she had before, and they sat in the same sunlit parlor, the air filled with the scent of freshly brewed tea. Their conversations flowed easily, and Lydia was struck by how natural it felt to sit with this woman who, for so many years, had been invisible to her. Over the course of several meetings, Lydia began to see life from a different perspective. Mrs. Green's stories of her travels with her husband, the quiet joy she found in gardening, and the contentment she felt in the simple rhythms of her days made Lydia question everything she had once held dear. They were stories of a life rich with meaning, but not in the ways Lydia had been taught to value. "How did you do it?" Lydia asked one afternoon, her voice laced with genuine curiosity. "How did you walk away from the life you could have had, wealth, parties, recognition, and choose something so different?" Mrs. Green smiled softly, the lines around her eyes crinkling in a way that made her seem even more at peace. "I didn't walk away from anything, Mrs. Carrington. I simply chose what made me happiest. Money and recognition don't last. What lasts is the impact you leave on others and the peace you make with yourself." When my husband passed, I realized that I didn't want my life to be defined by what I had, but by what I gave. Lydia sat back, absorbing the words. She had never thought about life in terms of giving, at least not beyond the charitable donations she made for the sake of her reputation. But Mrs. Green wasn't talking about money or material gifts. She was talking about time, kindness, and purpose. "Don't you ever miss it?" Lydia asked, her voice soft. "The wealth, the lifestyle?" Mrs. Green shook her head gently. "I have all the wealth I could need, but it's not the kind that can be measured in dollars. And the lifestyle I have now is one of my choosing. That's true freedom." Freedom. The word lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Lydia had always thought her wealth granted her freedom. Freedom to do whatever she pleased, to live without worry. But sitting here, in Mrs. Green's peaceful home, Lydia realized she had never been more wrong. The wealth she clung to had chained her, limiting her ability to see beyond the superficial. And now, for the first time, she was beginning to understand that the true freedom she had been searching for all her life wasn't in what she owned or how people perceived her. It was in the choices she made for herself, independent of status or expectation. As Lydia left Mrs. Green's estate that day, the sun dipping low on the horizon, she knew something fundamental had changed. The path she had been walking for so long suddenly felt empty, and for the first time, she found herself searching for a new direction, one that would lead her to the kind of freedom Mrs. Green had discovered long ago. Lydia had always believed that her social circle was a reflection of her success. The people she surrounded herself with, wealthy, influential, glamorous, had seemed like the perfect indicators of a life well lived. For years, her closest friends were the same women who graced the pages of high society magazines. Their laughter always a bit too loud, their smiles a bit too polished. But now, after her conversations with Mrs. Green, Lydia began to see them differently. It started subtly, with little things she hadn't noticed before. At the next gathering of her elite circle, a private luncheon at an exclusive club, Lydia arrived, feeling oddly out of place among her own peers. The women greeted her with their usual air kisses and idle chatter, and the conversation flowed easily from one trivial subject to another. But as Lydia listened, she realized how shallow it all felt. "I had to let go of my housekeeper last week," one of the women, Valerie, said with a wave of her hand, as if dismissing an insignificant detail. "She couldn't keep up with the demands. It's so hard to find good help these days, don't you think?" The other women nodded in agreement, their voices blending into a chorus of complaints about staff, renovations, and the latest fashions. Lydia found herself nodding along out of habit, but her mind wandered back to Mrs. Green. What would she think if she were sitting at this table, listening to them? Lydia's eyes drifted over the group, and suddenly she felt as if she were seeing them for the first time. The superficiality of their conversations, the casual dismissal of people who worked tirelessly for them, the endless pursuit of status, it all felt hollow. For years, Lydia had been a part of this, had reveled in it. But now, after everything Mrs. Green had shared with her, she could no longer find joy in these shallow exchanges. As the lunch wore on, Lydia felt increasingly disconnected. The laughter at the table felt forced, the smiles painted on. When one of the women leaned in to gossip about someone who wasn't present, Lydia found herself shrinking back. The judgment, the elitism, it all felt so toxic. "Did you hear about Sandra?" the woman whispered conspiratorially. "Apparently, her husband's business is struggling. I wouldn't be surprised if they have to downsize soon." Lydia's stomach turned. It was the kind of conversation she would have indulged in without a second thought not long ago. But now, all she could think about was how cruel it was to relish in someone else's misfortune. Mrs. Green had never spoken a word of judgment about anyone, despite having more wealth and grace than most of the women at this table. Her kindness, her humility, stood in stark contrast to the bitter, shallow exchanges Lydia was surrounded by now. "I heard she's selling her beach house," another woman chimed in with a smirk. "Such a shame." Lydia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, barely able to engage. When the conversation turned to luxury vacations and designer wardrobes, she excused herself, mumbling something about needing fresh air. As she stepped out onto the terrace, the cool breeze hit her face, and she took a deep breath, feeling as though she had escaped from a cage. Looking out over the city skyline, Lydia realized how suffocating her life had become. She had spent years climbing a social ladder that now seemed utterly meaningless. Her friends were people who valued appearances above all else, and she had been no different until now. But after her time with Mrs. Green, the cracks in that world were starting to show. Lydia wasn't sure she wanted to be part of it anymore. She thought about the sincerity she had found in Mrs. Green's company, the peace that radiated from her simple life. It was a stark contrast to the performative friendships Lydia had built, relationships that thrived on envy, competition, and a constant need to outdo one another. Suddenly, the lifestyle she had once cherished felt shallow, devoid of any real substance or connection. As Lydia stood on the terrace, she realized that something had shifted inside her. The wealth and status she had always clung to no longer seemed fulfilling. She longed for the genuine conversations she had shared with Mrs. Green, for the quiet wisdom and the sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for so long. It dawned on her that the people she had surrounded herself with wouldn't understand this change. They wouldn't understand why she no longer cared about the things that had once seemed so important. And that was fine. Lydia knew that moving forward, she would need to start seeking out something more. A life that wasn't measured by appearances or wealth, but by the quality of the connections she made and the purpose she found. For the first time, Lydia felt a desire to break free from the gilded cage she had built for herself, even if it meant leaving behind the very people who had once been the center of her world. It was an early autumn evening when Lydia found herself sitting once again in Mrs. Green's parlor, the soft glow of the setting sun casting a warm light across the room. The tranquility of the moment contrasted sharply with the internal turmoil Lydia had been feeling since their last visit. She had finally come to terms with the fact that her life, once envied by others, no longer fulfilled her in the way it once had. But even more pressing on her mind was a question that had been gnawing at her. Why had Mrs. Green, with all her wealth, chosen such a humble life? As they sipped their tea, Lydia decided it was time to ask. She set her cup down carefully, the delicate clink of porcelain breaking the quiet, and took a breath. "Mrs. Green," she began, her voice calm but curious, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but with everything you have, this beautiful home, the wealth your husband left you, why did you choose this? Why work as a maid when you could have lived in luxury?" Mrs. Green's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement, as if she had anticipated the question. She placed her cup on the table and folded her hands in her lap, looking out of the window for a moment before turning her attention back to Lydia. "It's a question I get from time to time, and I suppose it's a fair one," she said, her voice soft but sure. "But the truth is, money was never what made me happy. When my husband passed, I was faced with the reality that all the wealth we had built together couldn't fill the void he left behind. It took me some time, but I realized that real happiness, real fulfillment, doesn't come from what you have. It comes from how you live." Lydia leaned forward slightly, hanging on Mrs. Green's words. "But why work? You could have traveled the world, bought anything you wanted." Mrs. Green nodded thoughtfully. "I could have, yes. And for a while I did travel. But after a few years it became clear that what I was looking for couldn't be found in lavish trips or fine things. I missed having a purpose. I missed feeling connected to something greater than myself. So I decided to return to work, not because I needed the money, but because I needed to feel useful. There's a deep satisfaction that comes from helping others, from being part of a community, even if it's in a quiet, unseen way." Lydia absorbed her words, feeling an unfamiliar sense of clarity settle over her. It was the kind of contentment that Lydia had always thought came from success, from being admired, envied, even. But Mrs. Green had found it in the very things Lydia had long overlooked: humility, service, and the simple joys of life. "But didn't you ever miss the recognition?" Lydia asked carefully. "Didn't you want people to know what you'd accomplished?" Mrs. Green smiled, shaking her head slightly. "I've found that the most meaningful moments in life often go unnoticed by the world at large. My husband and I built a fortune together, but when he was gone, none of that mattered. I learned to measure success differently, not by what I had, but by how I made others feel. That's where the real richness in life comes from, Mrs. Carrington. Not in the things we own, but in the relationships we build, the kindness we show, and the peace we find within ourselves." Lydia sat back in her chair, the weight of Mrs. Green's words sinking deep into her. For so long, Lydia had believed that her worth was tied to her possessions, her status. But here was Mrs. Green, a woman who had lived a life of quiet grace, who had chosen service over spectacle, and she was far more content than Lydia had ever been. It was humbling, and yet, for the first time, Lydia didn't feel shame in that realization. Instead, she felt free. "I think I understand," Lydia said quietly. "For years, I've been chasing something that never really made me happy. I thought if I had more, if I achieved more, I'd finally feel complete. But now, sitting here with you, I'm starting to see that maybe I've been looking in the wrong places." Mrs. Green's smile widened, her eyes full of warmth. "It's never too late to change your path, Mrs. Carrington. Life has a way of showing us what we need, even if it takes some time to realize it. We all have our own journey, but the important thing is to live it with purpose." The room fell into a comfortable silence after that, the kind that only comes with true understanding. As Lydia sat there watching the sun set beyond the horizon, she knew that something within her had shifted permanently. She had spent so much of her life measuring her worth by the wrong standards, but now, with Mrs. Green's quiet wisdom to guide her, she was ready to start living for something more. For the first time in years, Lydia felt at peace with the idea of stepping away from the life she had built and towards something far more meaningful. Lydia's life had begun to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was as if the veil that had once clouded her view of the world had lifted, revealing a deeper truth about the things that really mattered. The transformation wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was steady and deliberate. She found herself questioning the choices she had made, the people she surrounded herself with, and most importantly, what she truly wanted her life to look like moving forward. Her first step was subtle but significant, distancing herself from the toxic relationships she had spent years cultivating. The same women who had once been her closest confidants now seemed distant, their endless discussions of material wealth and social status leaving Lydia feeling empty. She no longer wanted to sit through conversations that revolved around the shallow pursuit of more money, more prestige, more things. Instead, Lydia craved the genuine connection she had found in her conversations with Mrs. Green. The next time she received an invitation to one of her social circle's lavish luncheons, Lydia politely declined. She realized with a sense of clarity that she no longer needed their approval or their companionship. These gatherings, once so central to her identity, now seemed hollow. It wasn't just that the people had changed. It was Lydia who had changed. She no longer saw the value in maintaining friendships that were based on appearances, competition, and superficiality. Her decision to pull away didn't go unnoticed. Several of her friends reached out, confused by her sudden absence from the usual events. One of them, Valerie, even called to ask if something was wrong. "Lydia, darling, we've hardly seen you lately," Valerie said, her voice dripping with concern. "Is everything okay?" Lydia hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain the shift that had taken place within her. But then she realized that she didn't owe anyone an explanation, least of all someone who had never really known her beyond the surface. "I've just been reflecting on a few things," she said carefully. "I think I need some time to figure out what's important to me." Valerie was silent for a beat, then let out a light laugh. "Well, don't take too long, darling. You know how quickly people move on." Lydia smiled politely through the phone, but the comment only confirmed what she had already begun to understand. Her so-called friends cared more about maintaining their status than they did about genuine connection. They thrived on the appearance of friendship, but the substance behind it was thin, and Lydia had no desire to keep playing that game. In the weeks that followed, Lydia found herself drawn to simpler pleasures, ones she had long taken for granted. She spent more time in her garden, a place she had barely visited before, allowing herself to enjoy the peacefulness of the outdoors. She began reading books she had always meant to, but never had the time for. And most importantly, she continued visiting Mrs. Green, whose quiet wisdom had become a source of comfort and inspiration. Mrs. Green had become more than just a mentor. She had become a true friend, someone who saw the real Lydia beneath the layers of wealth and status that had once defined her. Their conversations were rich with meaning, exploring topics that Lydia had never had the space to think about before. They talked about life, about loss, and about finding purpose in the everyday. One afternoon, after sharing a meal in Mrs. Green's cozy dining room, Lydia confessed something she had been holding inside for weeks. "I'm scared," she said quietly, looking down at her plate. "I'm scared that if I let go of everything I've built, I won't know who I am anymore." Mrs. Green gave her a soft smile. "It's natural to feel that way, but sometimes letting go is the only way to find out who you truly are." Lydia nodded, feeling a mix of fear and relief. She had spent so long tying her identity to the things she owned, the people she knew, and the events she hosted. But now, for the first time, she was willing to let go of that image and discover who she was without it. "I want to live a life with purpose," Lydia said, her voice steady. "I want to make choices that mean something, not just for the sake of keeping up appearances." Mrs. Green reached across the table and squeezed Lydia's hand. "You're already on that path," she said softly. "The fact that you're asking these questions, that you're willing to change, it means you've already begun." As Lydia sat there, surrounded by the warmth and comfort of Mrs. Green's home, she realized that her fear was beginning to give way to something else: hope. She didn't need to have all the answers yet. What mattered was that she was ready to start living differently, to break free from the expectations that had once defined her. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Lydia no longer felt trapped by her past. Instead, she felt liberated by the possibilities that lay before her. Lydia's transformation was gradual but undeniable. She had finally embraced a life free from the pressures of maintaining a flawless image, and it showed in the way she carried herself, lighter, more at ease. The days of obsessing over social events, worrying about her status, or fretting over the approval of her peers were behind her. In their place, she had found something far more valuable: peace. She spent more time with Mrs. Green, not out of guilt or obligation, but because their friendship had blossomed into something meaningful. The bond they shared was unlike any Lydia had ever experienced. Mrs. Green had become more than a mentor. She was a trusted confidant, someone who had helped Lydia see the world in a way she never had before. Their afternoons together were filled with conversation, laughter, and the kind of quiet moments that spoke volumes without the need for words. As Lydia let go of her old life, she found herself drawn to acts of kindness she had once overlooked. She began volunteering her time, using her wealth to support causes that genuinely mattered to her, rather than just for appearances. She connected with people on a level she hadn't known was possible, discovering a richness in life that had nothing to do with money or status. Her old friends faded into the background, many of them confused or disinterested in her new perspective. But Lydia didn't mind. She no longer felt the need to explain herself, nor did she miss the empty conversations and social posturing. In their place, she found new friendships, built on authenticity and shared values. One afternoon, sitting in Mrs. Green's sunlit garden, Lydia looked at her friend and smiled. "You've changed my life in ways I didn't expect," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Mrs. Green smiled back, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "I didn't change your life, Lydia. You did that yourself. All I did was help you see what was already there." Lydia sat back, the peace she had found within herself radiating outward. For the first time in her life, she felt truly content. Her wealth, her status, they were no longer the measures of her worth. What mattered now was the life she was building, one rooted in kindness, purpose, and genuine connection. As the sun set over the garden, casting a warm glow over the two women, Lydia realized that this simple, quiet moment was the kind of wealth she had been searching for all along. And now she had finally found it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.